All right, welcome back to another episode of the Podium Pusher podcast. My name is Justin, all by myself today to make some predictions for the Emilia Romagna Grand Prix happening in Imola. It's been a while since we've been there. Took a year off last year because of some weather. We are so back. Let's jump right into it with who I think is going to be on pole for the Emilia Romagna Grand Prix, and I think it is going to be Max Verstappen. And I think for the first time of me saying Max Verstappen for a prediction all year, this might be a bit of a bold prediction with McLaren having the upgrades that they had last weekend and now Oscar having those upgrades as well, and Ferrari having a big upgrade package for this weekend. Maybe Max Verstappen pole position is a bit bold. Red Bull obviously have some upgrades as well, but they're expected to be more minor, so we'll still have to see how the teams stack up against each other when we get to Saturday qualifying. That'll be our first true showing of what the pace is of the different teams with their upgrades, but I'm still going to say that Max Verstappen is going to get pole. He has done a very good job of getting poles this year, still on quite the streak of maintaining those pole positions, so I think he's going to come out on top for qualifying for the Emilia Romagna Grand Prix. Obviously, Charles Leclerc will be a good shout for pole position. If I had to pick someone besides Max Verstappen, I would go with Charles Leclerc. I think he is probably the best qualifier on the grid when it just comes to pure one-lap pace. He always finds a way to get the most out of that Ferrari. And so with those upgrades, if they are even within a tenth, 2/10, maybe even 3/10 of Red Bull when it comes to one-lap pace, I think Charles Leclerc will be within a shout for pole position. But my official prediction is Max Verstappen for pole position at the Emilia Romagna Grand Prix. All right, moving on to my podium predictions. In third place, it's the man I just talked about, Charles Leclerc. I think those Ferrari upgrades are going to work a treat. He is going to make it back-to-back podiums. Just got a P3 in Miami, and I think he's going to go P3 again here in Imola. I would love to say that we're going to have a three-way title fight between the McLaren, the Ferrari, and the Red Bull. Not ready to say that yet. We haven't seen the big wave of upgrades on track from Ferrari, and so who knows how close that's really going to put them to Red Bull. But I think, Charles Leclerc has had a very consistent start to the season. He's put himself in a position to where if Ferrari ends up having those upgrades that allow them to compete with Red Bull at the front, Charles Leclerc is in no way out of a title fight, and I think that P3 this weekend will be exactly what he needs to help himself stay in that position should the Ferrari upgrades turn out to be a source of a lot of performance. In P2, I have gone for Max Verstappen. I don't think he's going to win this weekend. I think he's going to have another solid weekend. I think it would be crazy to predict against Red Bull and Max Verstappen to have a good weekend, especially at a track like Imola. We know that Adrian Newey, the man behind that Red Bull machine, has always produced cars that perform very well at low speed, high downforce circuits, and Imola is kind of one of those circuits. There's not a huge amount of overtaking opportunities. It's definitely an older track, so it's a skinnier track designed for an older era of Formula One cars, and the Red Bull chassis has always performed well at circuits like that. You can think even back to when we first returned to this track in 2020. Max Verstappen was racing the Mercedes in that race before he ended up having his DNF. So I think Red Bull will be extremely strong around this track. Obviously, we've seen Max Verstappen win at Imola before, and so I think it's going to be a great weekend for Max Verstappen. I think he will end up coming just short of that win and finish P2. And in first place, you can say I've got recency bias if you want to, but I think Lando Norris is going to win the Emilia Romagna Grand Prix and win 2 races in a row. This might be crazy, and you can call me crazy for just seeing a Lando Norris win last week and being ready to predict him for a win again this week, but Lando loves Imola. We've seen him get podiums here in the past. He got a podium in 2021 and 2022. That McLaren was terrible when he got a podium there in 2022. So for the McLaren that he has underneath him this year, how much he loves this track, how much he seems to be at one with that car, I think Lando Norris should be the favorite to win this race, which is a crazy thing to say because Max Verstappen has been the guy who we just think is going to win every single race, and it's going to be a random race if someone else ends up winning. But I think Lando Norris should be the favorite based on his track record at Imola and how that McLaren seems to be performing. I don't think Miami was a one-up. I think that car has genuine pace. And so I think Lando Norris is going to win his second race of his career and second race in a row when we get to the Emilia Romagna Grand Prix. For my podium pusher of the weekend, I think it's going to be Pierre Gasly. We saw Esteban Ocon bring home Alpine's first point of the year last weekend. I think it's Pierre Gasly's turn to have a good weekend. He's performed well at Imola in the past. Obviously, he was a driver at AlphaTauri for a couple years after his stint at Red Bull, and he was with Toro Rosso before him, but that's not the point. We all know Pierre Gasly's path through Formula One, but while he was at AlphaTauri 2020, 2021, and 2022, they did a lot of testing at Imola, so he's very familiar with that track. We've seen him do incredibly well at that track. I think of 2020 qualifying. He qualified really high. Same thing in 2021. Races didn't turn out how he wanted due to issues with the car and a crazy team strategy decision to put him on the wets in 2021. But I think Pierre Gasly is going to have a great weekend. He probably should have been the one to score points for Alpine last weekend if the safety car didn't happen where it did. And so I think Pierre Gasly is going to get some redemption at Imola this weekend. He's wearing a Senna-themed helmet, which always seems to give him a little bit of extra pace too. So Pierre Gasly is my prediction for podium pusher of the weekend. My back marker of the weekend is Sergio Perez. I think he is not going to have a great weekend here in Imola, and I don't think it's going to be anything that's like a huge mistake or getting knocked out in Q2 or binning in practice, anything like that. And if it is, I'll still take the point. I'll still say that I got it right because I predicted that he'd be the back marker of the weekend and not a bad weekend. But I simply think it will just be that he is finishing in P6 or P7 and getting out qualified by Ferraris and McLarens. I think with those teams bringing upgrades and closing up to Red Bull at the front of the pack, I think Sergio Perez is just going to fall behind those drivers. We've seen him have a pretty substantial gap to Max Verstappen over, the last couple of races, really the last couple of years, but he still pretty much had that consistent gap behind Max Verstappen. And so now that these other teams are bringing upgrades, they're just fitting into that gap that Sergio Perez had. And so it's not that he's performing any worse or any extra off the pace of Max Verstappen. It's just those other teams are filling in that gap. And so unfortunately, I think that's going to lead to Sergio Perez getting what seems to be a bad result, even though he didn't necessarily have a bad weekend on track. I think that's going to reflect poorly on him. I think we're going to start to see Red Bull suffer a little bit in the constructor standings. We're going to start to see that gap come down a little bit, with both Ferrari drivers performing very well this year so far. And I think once Oscar Piastri has the full set of McLaren upgrades and just has a cleaner weekend, obviously McLaren would have scored more points last weekend had they not had a driver taken out in the sprint and in the main race. So a cleaner weekend for them could see them close up to the front as well. But yeah, I think Sergio Perez is just going to finish behind those upgraded McLarens and Ferraris and end up being my back marker of the weekend. All right, it's time to make some bold predictions for the Emilia Romagna Grand Prix. My first bold prediction is that I think only one Mercedes is going to make it into Q3. That might seem to be not super bold, but I mean, still, they're the fourth fastest, maybe the fifth fastest car, depending on the weekend. So theoretically, both of them should make it into Q3. I wanted to say that Lewis Hamilton is going to get knocked out in Q2, but that seemed a little too specific. I know that I've got to leave it kind of broad to claim the point no matter what happens. So I'm going to say that only one Mercedes makes it through into Q3. I do believe it's going to be George Russell. He's been outperforming Lewis Hamilton this year, not by a crazy amount, but it just has been a pattern of George Russell having an edge over Lewis Hamilton, especially in qualifying. And that's not super surprising. All throughout his career, George Russell has been a very good qualifier. We've thought of him as Mr. Saturday from his days in the Williams, and that had kind of faded a little bit, especially last year. Lewis Hamilton really had the upper hand on him, but I think this year we've seen George Russell stake a claim to be that number one driver of the team when Lewis leaves. I don't expect this weekend to be any different. And so my first bold prediction is that only one Mercedes is going to make it into Q3. My second bold prediction is that Oscar Piastri and Carlos Sainz have another incident, whether that be on track in a free practice or somewhere in the media pen. This is such like a weird rivalry to me. I don't want to say rivalry because I don't think they hate each other or have any animosity towards each other or anything. It just seems like Oscar Piastri and Carlos Sainz are always coming together. And with the Ferraris getting the upgrades and Oscar getting the McLaren upgrades this year, I can imagine that they're going to be near each other on track again. So I could see it being something in a non-competitive session or them coming together during the race. So going to keep my options open for this one as well and say just all weekend, if they come together at any point, I'm going to call it an on-track incident and say that I get this point, even if it's just them complaining about each other over the radio. And so I think Oscar Piastri and Carlos Sainz are going to find a way to be near each other, have another incident, and that is my second bold prediction for the Emilia Romagna Grand Prix. All right, that's all we've got. Thank you guys so much for listening. I hope you enjoyed this episode of the Podium Pusher podcast. As always, if you haven't already, feel free to like and subscribe. Follow us on YouTube. You know the deal. You can also find us on Instagram, Twitter, TikTok, Spotify, wherever you listen to podcasts, you can find the Podium Pushers. We're so excited just to continue to get to make Formula One content for you guys. It's such an honor that you would choose to let us be the people that talk to you about Formula One. And so that's awesome. We're super thankful. Hope you guys have an amazing week getting ready for the Emilia Romagna Grand Prix. Formula One truly is the best sport in the world, and we're so glad we get to share it with you. Have an awesome week. We'll see you in the next one. See ya.